Have you ever felt time stop? Not metaphorically, but completely? Like the second hand on a clock just gave up? That's what it was like lying there on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was 43 years old, a construction supervisor, the kind of man who didn't believe in much of anything beyond what he could measure with his own two hands. And then my heart stopped. Not for a few seconds, not for a minute, for 45 minutes. The doctors would later tell my wife there was nothing left to hope for, that the machines were keeping a body running, and that the man inside it was already gone. But here's the thing they couldn't explain. When I came back, when my heart, against every law of medicine, started beating again, I knew things I had no way of knowing. I described a conversation that happened in the hallway, word for word, a conversation I wasn't there for. I told my daughter about a necklace she'd hidden in her drawer 3 days earlier, one she'd never shown anyone. I knew the exact time my uncle died, 2 states away, before anyone had called to tell us. For 45 minutes I was somewhere else, and what I brought back wasn't a memory. It was something else entirely. I need to start at the beginning, because the beginning matters. It tells you who I was before, so you understand what changed. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows whose truck is parked outside the diner before the owner even sits down. My father worked in a factory for 31 years. My mother kept the books for a feed store. We went to church on Sundays because that's what people did, not because anyone in our house spent much time thinking about what it meant. By the time I was 20, I was already working construction. By 30, I was running crews. By 40, I had my own small company. Nothing big, just enough to keep 15 guys employed and put my kids through school without too much worry. I tell you this because I want you to understand I was not a spiritual man. I was not someone who read books about consciousness or near-death experiences or any of that. If you'd shown me an article about people seeing tunnels of light, I would have changed the channel. Not out of disrespect. Just, it wasn't my world. My world was steel beams, deadlines, payroll, and the smell of sawdust in my truck. My wife, Carol, used to tease me about it. She'd come home from her book club talking about energy and intuition, and I'd nod along while thinking about whether the concrete pour was going to set right before the weather turned. We were happy. 2 kids, Daniel, who was 22 and finishing up his engineering degree, and Megan, who was 19 and still living at home, still figuring out what she wanted from life. That Tuesday started like every other Tuesday. I remember the weather. I remember it because I'd checked it 3 times that morning. We had a concrete pour scheduled, and rain would push us back a full week. Overcast, 61 degrees, a 10% chance of rain that I didn't like the look of. I drove to the site around 6:30, stopped for coffee, black, no sugar, the same thing I'd ordered every morning for 20 years. The girl at the counter, Brenda, asked if I wanted my usual, and I said yes, like I always did. I want you to notice how ordinary this is, how nothing about this morning suggested anything was coming. Because that's the thing about the moment everything changes. It almost never announces itself. It just arrives wearing the same clothes as yesterday. Around 9:40, I was walking the site, checking on the second floor framing. I remember reaching for the railing, and then there's a gap, not a blur, a gap, like a page torn cleanly out of a book. What I learned later, pieced together from witnesses, from the paramedic's report, from Carol holding my hand in the hospital and telling me what she'd been told, is that I collapsed, just folded mid-step onto the plywood subfloor. One of my crew, a kid named Tyler, who was maybe 25, found me less than a minute later. He said my lips were already turning blue. Tyler had taken a CPR course 8 months earlier, some mandatory thing through the company. He'd complained about it at the time, said it was a waste of a Saturday morning. That Saturday morning is the reason I'm alive to tell you this story. He started compressions immediately, called 911 with one hand while pushing on my chest with the other, screaming for someone to find the site's defibrillator, which, thank God, we'd installed 18 months prior after a new safety regulation came through. Most job sites that size didn't have one. Ours did because of a regulation, because of paperwork. I think about that a lot now. How many small, boring decisions, a CPR course nobody wanted to take, a safety regulation nobody celebrated, became the threads that kept me tethered to this world long enough for what happened next to happen at all. The paramedics arrived 9 minutes after the call. 9 minutes of Tyler's hands on my chest, not stopping, not slowing down, even as his arms burned, and his voice gave out from yelling for help. By the time they got me into the ambulance, I had been clinically dead. No heartbeat, no breath, nothing the machines could detect for roughly 11 minutes. They got a rhythm back in the ambulance, weak, irregular. But there, and then, on the way to the hospital, it stopped again. This time for longer. This time for the part of the story I actually remember. I want to tell you what it felt like, the moment my heart stopped for the second time. Not what I think it should have felt like, what it actually felt like. There was no pain. I want to say that first because I know that's the question, the one people are too afraid to ask out loud. There was no pain, there was no fear either, which surprised me more than anything else because fear had been with me my whole life in small, ordinary ways. Fear of losing the business, fear of letting my kids down, fear of getting old and becoming a burden. That fear had been a low hum underneath everything I did for 43 years, and in that ambulance it just stopped. Like someone had reached over and turned off a radio I'd forgotten was even playing. What replaced it was something I've spent 2 years trying to describe to people, and I still don't have the right words. The closest I can get is this. It felt like waking up from being asleep. Except I hadn't realized until that moment that my entire life had been the sleep. I wasn't in the ambulance anymore. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I'm not telling you I floated up and looked down at my body, though people who've had these experiences often describe exactly that. For me, it was different. There was no up, there was no looking down, there was just a shift, like a camera that had been pointed in one direction for 43 years suddenly turned and showed me something that had apparently been there all along. I was aware of motion, not movement through space. I keep wanting to use spatial words because that's the only vocabulary I have, but they're wrong. It wasn't like flying or falling. It was more like being recalibrated, like a radio dial slowly turning, and the static clearing, and somewhere underneath the static, a signal that had been there the whole time. And then there was light. I know how that sounds. I told you earlier I wasn't a man who read about tunnels of light, and I wasn't being modest. I genuinely did not know this was a thing people described. So when I tell you there was light, I need you to understand I wasn't expecting it. I wasn't pattern matching to some story I had heard. It was just there. Suddenly there, the way the sun is just there when you walk outside on a bright day, except this light didn't come from a direction. It didn't cast shadows. It was simply the condition of everything, the way water is the condition of being underwater. And it wasn't blinding. That's the part people get wrong when they imagine it. They think bright light means something harsh, something you'd squint against. This was the opposite. It was the gentlest thing I have ever experienced. It felt like the moment right before someone you love says something kind to you. That anticipation stretched out and made permanent. I felt, and this is the part that still catches in my throat when I try to say it out loud, I felt known, not seen, known, the way you might feel if someone could read every choice you'd ever made, every secret thought, every moment you were proud of and every moment you weren't, and after taking all of it in, they were glad you existed anyway. I had never felt that in my entire life. Not from my parents, who loved me but weren't the kind of people who said it. Not from Carol, much as I loved her. There's always some part of yourself you keep back, even from the person you sleep beside every night. Some room in the house you keep the door closed on. There were no closed doors there. I don't know how long this lasted. I want to be honest about that because I've read since then about people who say it felt like hours or no time at all, and I understand both of those descriptions now in a way I couldn't have before. It was both. It was no time, and it was enough time for something in me to fundamentally rearrange, and then I started to notice I wasn't alone. I became aware of a presence beside me before I saw anything. That's the order it happened in. Presence first, then form. It's strange to describe it that way, but it's the truth. In our world, you see someone approaching before you feel them there. In that place, it was reversed. I felt him. And then somehow my awareness resolved into something like sight, and there he was, my grandfather, Walter. He died when I was 6 years old. I have almost no memories of him, just fragments. The smell of his pipe tobacco, a green flannel shirt he wore in every photograph I'd ever seen, the sound of his laugh, which my mother always said was too big for the room. I knew him mostly through stories, through the way my father's voice changed, just slightly whenever he came up, and there he was. Not old the way he was in the photographs near the end, not young either. He was himself. The most himself I'd ever seen anyone be. There was a clarity to him, an unmistakable presence, like meeting someone for the first time and somehow already knowing their whole life. He didn't speak first. He just looked at me. And in that look, there is something I can only describe as recognition. Not the recognition of, oh, it's you, but the recognition of someone who had been waiting patiently for a long time. "You're not finished yet," he said. I remember the words exactly. I've turned them over so many times since then that they've worn smooth, like a stone you keep in your pocket. I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't need to. Something about being there, about whatever that place was, meant that questions arrived already half answered. You didn't need to ask, "Where am I?" because you already understood on some level beneath language exactly where you were and what it meant. What I needed instead was to tell him something, and the moment I thought it, he already knew. "Megan's necklace," I said, or thought, or however communication worked there. "She thinks she lost it. She's been looking for it for 3 days. It's not lost. She put it in the lining of her winter coat, the one in the back of her closet, because she was scared Daniel would borrow it again without asking and lose it for real this time." I don't know why that was the thing that surfaced. Of all the things in a man's life, 43 years of it, that was what rose to the top in that moment. My daughter's necklace, a small domestic worry, a 19-year-old girl hiding a piece of jewelry from her brother. But Walter just nodded, like it made perfect sense, like it was exactly the kind of thing that mattered. "Tell her," he said, "when you go back." And that's when I understood, really understood for the first time, that going back was something that was going to happen, that this wasn't the end of something. It was a pause, an interruption, a door that had been left open, not closed. I felt something that wasn't quite fear, but was close to it, a reluctance. Because if I'm honest with you, and I promised myself telling this story that I would be honest, even about the parts that don't make me look good, some part of me didn't want to go back. It wasn't that I didn't love my life. I did. Carol, Daniel, Megan, the crew, the business, even the stupid concrete pour I'd been worrying about that morning. I loved all of it. But there, in that light, surrounded by that feeling of being fully known and fully accepted anyway, there was a peace I had never once experienced in 43 years of living. Not on my wedding day, not when my children were born, not in any quiet moment of pride or rest I'd ever stolen for myself. And some part of me thought I could stay in this feeling forever, and it would be enough. Walter seemed to know that too. He didn't seem offended by it. If anything, there was something like warmth in his expression, the warmth of someone who remembered exactly what that pull felt like because he'd felt it himself once. "I know," he said. "I felt it too. Everyone does." "Then why?" I started, but he was already answering before I finished. "Because it's not your time, and because there's something you're supposed to bring back, not for you, for them." "Not for me?" I asked. "Then for who?" Walter didn't answer right away, and in the silence, if you can call it that, in a place with no sound the way we understand sound, I became aware that we weren't alone anymore. There were others. I want to be careful with this part because it's the part that's hardest to put into words without making it sound like something out of a movie. And it wasn't that. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a crowd or a gathering or anything with edges and numbers. It was more like when you're in a room with a window open and you can't see the wind, but you know it's there because of how everything in the room responds to it. The curtains move. The papers on the desk shift. You feel it on your skin. That's what the others felt like. Presences, not strangers, exactly. Though I didn't recognize most of them, but not threatening either. If anything, there was a kind of attention in them, like an audience that had been waiting for something, and that something was now happening. "They're not here for you," Walter said, and somehow I understood he meant it kindly. "They're here for what you'll carry back." I asked him, again, in whatever way thoughts travelled there, what that meant, what I was supposed to carry, and this is the part of the story I've thought about more than any other, more than the light, more than Walter, more than the peace even, which I still sometimes ache for. Late at night, when Carol's asleep and the house is quiet and I let myself remember what it felt like. He said, "You're going to meet someone soon, not here, when you go back. And when you meet them, you'll know things about them, things you have no way of knowing, and you're going to tell them, even though it will feel impossible, even though you'll want to talk yourself out of it." I asked him, "Who?" He said, "You'll know." And I want to describe this exactly the way it happened because I think the precision matters. The light around us seemed to thin, not dim exactly, thin, like fog lifting except in reverse, like something was being lifted away from me rather than around me. I felt a pulling sensation, not violent, not even unpleasant, but unmistakable, the way you feel the tide pulling at your ankles even before you've noticed the water has risen. "Walter," I said, or thought, and the thinking felt like the most urgent thing I'd ever done. "Wait, I don't understand. How will I know? How will I know who it is or what to say or—" "You'll know," he said again, and then softer. And this is the part that, when I tell it, my voice does something I can't control, even 2 years later. He said, "Tell your father I'm proud of him." He's never once heard that from me. I should have said it. Tell him I finally did. My father, Walter's son. A man who had spent 61 years, as far as I knew, never once hearing those words from his own father. A man who died when my father was 34, leaving things unsaid the way men of that generation so often did. And then the pulling became something else. Not a sensation in a body. I didn't have a body there, or at least not one I was aware of, but something deeper. Like being called back into a shape, like water returning to a glass it had been poured out of. The light didn't disappear so much as I moved away from it, or it moved away from me. I genuinely don't know which, and I'm not sure the distinction means anything there. The last thing I was aware of, the very last thing, before everything went dark and stayed dark for what I'd later learn, was almost 2 days, was a sound. A single sound, cutting through everything, a heartbeat monitor, beeping, once, then again, and then a voice, Carol's voice, except it sounded wrong, too sharp, too close, like she was shouting directly into my ear from somewhere very far away, saying my name over and over like she was trying to pull me back to shore with nothing but the sound of it. And then nothing. Darkness. Real darkness this time. Not the gentle absence of the light I'd left behind, but the ordinary darkness of unconsciousness, the kind that has weight to it, that presses down. I wouldn't open my eyes again for 31 hours. The first thing I became aware of coming back wasn't light. It wasn't sound either, not at first. It was weight. My own body felt like it belonged to someone else, heavy, foreign, full of aches I hadn't earned through any memory I could access. There was a tube down my throat. I couldn't speak. I could barely move my fingers, and even that small motion sent something like fire up through my arm. But I could hear. The first voice I heard clearly was Carol's. She wasn't talking to me. She was on the phone in the corner of the room, and her voice had that flat, exhausted quality that comes after you've cried so much there's nothing left to cry with. She was talking to her sister, telling her the doctors had said to prepare for the possibility that even if I woke up, I might not be all there. That 45 minutes without a heartbeat, even with CPR, even with everything that had gone right, was 45 minutes the brain wasn't built to survive intact. I remember wanting to tell her I was fine, that I could hear her, that I was, in fact, more there than I had ever been in my entire life, more present, more aware, more myself than during any ordinary Tuesday of the previous 43 years. But I couldn't make a sound. I could only lie there, trapped behind my own eyes, listening to my wife brace herself for the worst version of me. It took another 6 hours before I could open my eyes, another full day before they removed the tube and I could speak, just a whisper, my throat raw and torn. And when I finally could speak, the first thing I said wasn't "I love you," though I did love her more than I had words for. It wasn't "Where am I?" or "What happened?" though I genuinely didn't know the full extent of it yet. The first thing I said was, "Megan's necklace is in her winter coat, the lining, in the closet." I want you to sit with that for a second, because I have sat with it for 2 years. Of everything. The light, Walter, the presences, the peace I'd felt that I still sometimes grieve for. The very first thing that came out of my mouth after 31 hours of darkness and 45 minutes of clinical death was a detail about a missing necklace. Carol stared at me. She told me later she thought it was brain damage. Some kind of confused, garbled fragment from a man who'd been deprived of oxygen for far too long. She said, gently, "Honey, you're okay. You don't have to worry about that right now." But I kept going. I told her, slowly, painfully, one whispered word at a time, that Megan had hidden it there 3 days before any of this happened, that she was scared Daniel would take it again, that it wasn't lost, that she needed to know. Carol didn't say anything for a long moment, then she got up, walked into the hallway, and I heard her voice, quiet, careful, calling Megan's cell phone. Megan came to the hospital 2 hours later. She'd been at a friend's house, hadn't wanted to leave campus during finals week, but Carol had insisted. When she walked in, her eyes were red, and she looked at me the way you look at someone you'd already started preparing to lose. I asked Carol to leave us alone for a minute. She did, and I told Megan, still in that broken, raw whisper, to check the lining of her winter coat, the one in the back of her closet. She frowned at me, confused. A little scared, honestly, like maybe her dad really had come back wrong, just like the doctors warned. But she went home that night and checked. The necklace was there, exactly where I'd said, exactly where she'd hidden it 3 days before I ever knew it was missing, because she'd never told a single person where she'd put it, not Carol, not Daniel, no one. She called me at 11 o'clock that night, crying, asking how I could possibly have known. And I didn't have an answer for her. Not yet. The necklace was strange enough, but it was small. A private thing, a family thing. The kind of detail you could almost explain away if you tried hard enough. A father knows his daughter. Maybe he'd seen her hide it and forgotten. Maybe it was a lucky guess dressed up as something more. I want to be honest with you, even I tried to explain it away those first few days. Lying in that hospital bed, hooked up to monitors, I told myself it was probably nothing. A coincidence. The brain does strange things during trauma. Maybe I'd overheard something, maybe I'd dreamed it and gotten lucky. But then came my uncle. My mother's brother, Robert, lived 2 states away, in Indiana. We weren't close. A Christmas card, most years, maybe a phone call on birthdays. He was 78 in declining health, but nothing acute, nothing anyone was watching closely. On the 3rd day after I woke up, my mother came to visit. She looked tired in a way I'd never seen before, not just from worry about me, but from something else, something I could see she was carrying alone. "Mom," I said, my voice still rough, "what's wrong besides all of this?" She tried to wave it off, said it wasn't important, not compared to what our family had just been through, but I pushed, gently, and eventually she told me. Uncle Robert had passed away just 2 days earlier, a heart attack in his sleep. Peaceful, the doctor had said. He hadn't suffered. She told me the date. The day before I'd woken up, the day I was still unconscious, still in that 31-hour darkness, and then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned the time. Just before 3 in the morning, the coroner had estimated, sometime between 2:30 and 3. I felt something go very still inside me, because I knew that time. I'd known it before she said it. The moment she started talking about Robert, a specific time had simply arrived in my mind, the way a name arrives when you see a familiar face, before you've consciously tried to remember it. 2:51 in the morning. I told her, quietly. Not as a guess, I stated it the way you'd state your own birthday. 2:51. My mother went pale. She asked how I could possibly know that. The hospital hadn't told anyone the exact time yet. Even she had only learned it an hour before walking into my room from a phone call with the coroner's office that she hadn't mentioned to a single person, including my father. I didn't have an explanation. Not one that made sense in the world I'd lived in for 43 years. But I had a memory, if you can call it that, of being in that place of light surrounded by presences when Walter told me about the others. I hadn't recognized most of them. I'd assumed they were strangers or symbols or something my mind had generated to make sense of an experience beyond language. What if one of them had been Robert? What if, in that timeless place, on the other side of a threshold I still don't fully understand, my uncle had been crossing over at almost exactly the same moment I was there, 2 paths intersecting for a heartbeat, in a place where time doesn't move the way it moves here? I don't know. I'll never know, not for certain, but I know the number, 2:51, and I know I said it before anyone could have told me. And I hadn't even gotten to the hardest part yet, because Walter had told me something else, something for my father. And I hadn't said it yet, because I didn't know how. My father came to see me 5 days after I woke up. He'd been there before, of course, sitting in the waiting room during the worst of it, holding Carol's hand, while the doctors used words like unlikely and prepare yourselves. But this was the first time he came alone. Just him. He's not a man who shows much. 61 years old, raised by a father who worked double shifts and came home too tired to talk, raised in a generation of men who measured love by what they provided, not what they said. I'd inherited some of that from him, if I'm honest. Carol used to joke that the men in our family expressed affection through fixing things. A leaky faucet, a broken fence, a car that wouldn't start. Never words, never directly. He sat down in the chair beside my bed, and for a while we just talked about ordinary things. The site, Tyler, had been by to visit and apparently hadn't stopped shaking for 2 days. The weather, It had rained, finally, the week after my collapse, the rain I'd been worried about before any of this happened. Small things, safe things. And then there was the silence. The kind of silence that, in our family, usually meant the visit was winding down, time to stand up, say, "All right then," and head home. But I didn't want him to leave. Not yet. Because I knew, I'd known since the moment I woke up, that there was something I was supposed to tell him, and I'd been putting it off because I genuinely did not know how to say it without sounding like I'd lost my mind. "Dad," I said, "can I tell you something? And I need you to just let me say it, all of it, before you say anything back." He looked at me carefully, nodded. "When I was gone," I said, "and even now telling you this, my throat tightens the way it did then, I saw Grandpa Walter." My father's face didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did, a kind of stillness that hadn't been there a moment before. "He looked good, Dad, really good, like himself, the way you always talked about him before things got hard at the end." My father didn't say anything, he just waited. "He asked me to tell you something," he said. And here my voice did break, just a little, because even saying it out loud felt like carrying something heavy across a long distance. "He said to tell you he's proud of you, that you never heard that from him, that he should have said it, and that he finally did." The room was completely silent. My father, a man I had seen cry exactly twice in my entire life, once at his own father's funeral and once at my daughter's birth, put his face in his hands. He didn't sob. It wasn't dramatic, the way you might picture it. It was quiet, just his shoulders moving slightly, and his breath catching in a way that told me everything. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, and he said something I'll never forget. He used to say that to me. In his head, I knew it. I always knew it somehow. But he never once said it out loud. Not in 61 years, not even at the end when he knew he was dying and there was nothing left to lose by saying it. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, the way men of his generation do, quickly, almost embarrassed by their own tears. "I used to wonder," he said, "if he just didn't feel it, if maybe I wasn't worth saying it for." And there it was, the thing Walter had known, the thing he'd carried across whatever threshold separates that place from this one and handed to me, a man who'd never even met him, to deliver to his own son. 61 years of silence, closed in an afternoon in a hospital room by 4 words spoken from somewhere I still can't fully explain. "He knew," I told my father. "He knew you wondered that. That's why he sent it." My father reached over and took my hand, something he hadn't done since I was a small child, and held it for a long time, neither of us saying anything else. We didn't need to. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and follow us every day. Stories like this one. They're not really about me. They're about something bigger that connects all of us, something most of us sense but rarely talk about. And there's more. Because the necklace and the time of my uncle's death, and even what I told my father, none of that was the end of what I brought back. There was one more thing, something Walter never explained, something I wouldn't understand until almost a year later, when I met someone I'd never seen before in my life, and somehow already knew everything about them. The person Walter meant. I met her 11 months later. Her name is Ruth, She's 82 years old, and at the time she was a resident at the same assisted living facility where my mother had recently moved, the kind of place where families bring flowers on Sundays and try not to count how many more Sundays there might be. I was there visiting my mother. Ruth was in the common room, sitting alone by the window, the way some residents do, not unhappy exactly, just apart. I'd never seen her before, never heard her name. There was no reason for our paths to have crossed at all, but when I walked past her, I stopped. I want to describe this carefully because it wasn't like a movie. There was no music, no slow-motion turn. It was quieter than that. It was the same feeling I'd had with Walter, recognition before form, a sense of knowing arriving a half-second before my eyes had even fully taken her in. I sat down across from her. She looked up, mildly curious, the way you might look at a stranger who sat a little too close. And I said, before I'd even decided to say anything, the words just arriving, the way Megan's necklace had arrived, the way 2:51 in the morning had arrived, your son, the one who passed. He wants you to know he's not angry anymore. Ruth went very still. She told me later that she hadn't spoken about her son in almost 6 years. Not to the staff, not to her daughter who visited weekly. He had died young, an overdose after years of estrangement, after a falling out so bitter that they hadn't spoken in the 4 years before his death. Ruth had carried that, the silence, the unresolved anger, the guilt of never reconciling, as a private wound she'd stopped showing to anyone because she'd stopped believing anyone could do anything with it except feel sorry for her. "Any more?" she said, very quietly. "What do you mean, any more?" And I told her everything. The accident, the 45 minutes, Walter, the light, the presences I hadn't recognized, and I told her something I hadn't even known I knew until the moment I said it out loud, that her son had been one of those presences, that he'd been there, in that place beyond language, carrying something of his own, the same way Walter had been carrying something for my father. That whatever anger he'd held when he died, it hadn't survived the crossing. That on the other side of whatever threshold I'd glimpsed, the things we carry here simply don't make the trip. Only love does. Only the parts of us that were ever real. Ruth cried for a long time, not the way my father had, quiet, contained, but openly, the way you cry when something that's been frozen for years finally thaws. She told me, through the tears, that her son's name had been Walter too. I didn't know that. I couldn't have known that. I think about that a lot. How a man named Walter, gone 40 years before I was born, could send a message to my father about pride, and in the same breath open a door that let another Walter reach his mother across 6 years of silence. Maybe that's what he meant when he said it wasn't for me. Maybe I was just a door, opened briefly, so things that needed saying could finally be said by people who could no longer say them themselves. I don't know how many more doors there are. I don't know if this will happen again, but I know this. For 43 years, I measured my life in steel beams and deadlines and payroll. I was a good man, I think, but I was an asleep man, and for 45 minutes I woke up. I brought something back, not a memory, not proof, just a door left open a little wider than it was before. If this story moved something in you, if some part of you recognized something in it, even something you can't quite name, I'd ask you to do 3 things. Follow this channel, so these stories keep finding you. share this video with 5 people who might need to hear it and leave a comment. Not a quick one, but a real one. Tell us about your own door, your own Walter, the thing you've carried, or the thing someone once carried for you. You're not alone in this. None of us ever were.